In the ancient world, names held power. To name something was to possess it, to shape its essence. Among the most sacred of all names was the name of God, whose true form was veiled behind layers of silence, reverence, and ritual. The 72 names of God, a mysterious and ancient tradition, were believed to be hidden in plain sight within the Hebrew Scriptures, embedded in 3 consecutive verses of the book of Exodus. These names, encoded into the very fabric of the Exodus story, were not mere words, but divine expressions of power meant to bridge the gap between the mortal and the celestial. The first references to these 72 names emerged in the context of Jewish mysticism during the Second Temple period. Scholars and scribes began to notice that certain verses, when read in a specific sequence, revealed patterns that were far more than literary structures. They were theologically significant, thought to contain the essence of God's presence. But these names were not to be uttered casually. To speak them was to acknowledge an intimate connection with the divine, and it was a connection that could either uplift the soul or lead to its downfall. In a world where the sacred and the profane were often indistinguishable, the names were treated with the utmost care. The ancient rabbis, aware of the dangers and potential of these words, encoded them into texts, only allowing access to them under strict conditions. The tradition surrounding the names was one of secrecy and protection. Those who sought to unlock their meaning were required to undergo rigorous moral and spiritual training, for only those pure of heart and intent could safely comprehend their power. In the centuries following, the names would become more than just a mystical puzzle. They would embody a key to the very structure of the universe. Through their contemplation, the practitioner could gain insight into the workings of creation itself, perceiving the hidden forces that shaped reality. Yet, this knowledge came at a great cost. To misuse these names was to risk a direct confrontation with the divine order, and many of those who sought to wield their power without understanding were left broken, their minds shattered by the weight of their own arrogance. As the tradition passed from one generation to the next, the 72 names slowly faded into the background of history, erased not through destruction, but through silence. The Jewish communities, increasingly concerned with the preservation of their faith against external threats, chose to focus on other aspects of their spiritual heritage. The names were no longer a common topic of discussion, hidden away in the secret texts of the most devoted scholars. Despite this retreat into obscurity, the names of God continued to echo in the minds of those who had once studied them. For these names were not truly lost. They had simply been buried under layers of time, theology, and fear. What had once been a powerful tool for spiritual ascent was now relegated to the shadows, a forgotten relic of an ancient past. Yet, as we explore this forgotten tradition, we begin to uncover the significance of these names, not as lost keys to divine power, but as a window into the sacred worldview of those who lived with them. And so, the story of the 72 names of God unfolds, not as a tale of forbidden magic, but as a profound reflection on the limits of human knowledge and the mysterious ways in which the divine reveals itself. Long before the 72 names were discussed in mystical writings, the foundation for their existence was laid within the Hebrew language itself. Ancient Hebrew was not understood merely as a tool for communication. It was perceived as a sacred system in which sound, shape, and meaning were inseparable. Letters were not arbitrary symbols, but vessels of intent, each carrying weight, history, and theological significance. Within this worldview, language did not describe reality. It participated in its formation. The Torah was approached with this awareness. Scribes did not copy its words casually. Every letter was counted, inspected, and preserved with ritual precision. Errors were not corrected, but destroyed, because corruption of the text was understood as distortion of divine order. In such an environment, patterns within the text drew attention not because they were clever, but because they were believed to be intentional. When interpreters noticed the unusual alignment of 3 consecutive verses describing the crossing of the sea, they did not see coincidence, they saw design. These verses describe divine movement, protection, and transformation. One speaks of divine presence moving behind the people, another of the sea parting, and the third of the waters returning. In the original Hebrew, each verse contains the same number of letters. Ancient exegetes observed that when these verses were written one above the other, alternating direction, one forward, one backward, one forward again, columns of letters emerged. Each column formed a 3-letter combination. 72 such combinations appeared, each derived directly from the sacred text without adding or removing a single character. This method of extraction was not arbitrary speculation. It reflected established interpretive practices in ancient Judaism, where the text was believed to contain multiple layers of meaning. Literal narrative existed alongside legal, ethical, and hidden dimensions. The hidden layer was not available to everyone. It required training, reverence, and restraint. The 72 names belonged to this concealed dimension, accessible only to those who understood that interpretation was a form of responsibility, not entitlement. Early Jewish sources do not present these names as a list to be recited. Instead, they are treated as manifestations of divine attributes expressed through language. Each name was understood as reflecting a specific mode of divine action: judgment, mercy, protection, transformation, endurance. Together, they formed a linguistic map of how the divine interacted with the created world. This was theology expressed not through abstract philosophy, but through structure, pattern, and sound. Crucially, this tradition existed alongside strict prohibitions concerning the pronunciation of the divine name. By the late Second Temple period, even the central name of God was no longer spoken aloud outside the temple. Substitutions were used in reading and prayer, reinforcing the idea that speech itself carried consequences. Within this framework, the 72 names were not simply unspoken, they were unexposed. Knowledge of their structure did not imply permission to vocalize them. Ancient teachers emphasized that the power of these names did not lie in sound alone. Intention, ethical conduct, and ritual purity were considered essential. Without them, the names were described as inert or even dangerous. This reflects a broader ancient belief that sacred knowledge divorced from moral responsibility leads not to enlightenment, but to collapse. The tradition was shaped as much by fear of misuse as by reverence for holiness. As Jewish communities faced political upheaval, exile, and increasing external pressure, this caution intensified. Mystical teachings were narrowed, restricted, and in many cases intentionally obscured. What survived did so in fragmented references, allusions, and warnings rather than direct exposition. Silence became a method of preservation. The absence of open instruction was not a sign that the tradition had vanished, but that it had been deliberately withdrawn from public access. Yet, even in this silence, traces remained. The structure of the 72 names continued to influence later theological reflection on divine attributes and the role of language in creation. The belief that the universe itself was spoken into existence reinforced the idea that words, when aligned with divine will, carried creative force. This was not magic in the later sense, but cosmology, an understanding of reality grounded in sacred speech. By examining the linguistic and textual foundations of the 72 names, it becomes clear that they were never meant to function as isolated formulas. They emerged from a worldview in which scripture, language, and divinity were inseparable. Their concealment was not accidental. It was a deliberate response to the recognition that some forms of knowledge demand restraint, and that the deepest truths are often those guarded most carefully by silence. As the Second Temple period progressed, the relationship between sacred knowledge and communal survival grew increasingly fragile. Jewish communities lived under foreign rule, facing cultural pressure, political violence, and theological challenge. In this environment, ideas about divine names were no longer abstract reflections on language and creation. They became matters of protection, identity, and boundary. What had once been contemplated within small circles of trained interpreters now carried the risk of misunderstanding, distortion, or exploitation. Rabbinic literature from the early centuries of the Common Era reflects this shift clearly. Discussions of divine names appear not as open teachings, but as guarded references surrounded by warnings. The concern was not curiosity, but control. Knowledge of the divine name was believed to confer authority, not over God, but within the moral and spiritual order established by God. To mishandle that authority was to invite chaos. As a result, access to such knowledge was increasingly restricted to mature scholars whose lives demonstrated discipline, humility, and obedience to the law. In this context, the 72 names were framed not as a list to be learned, but as a structure to be respected. Early rabbinic thought emphasized that the divine name was inseparable from divine will. Knowing the name, without aligning oneself with the will it represented, was considered meaningless at best and destructive at worst. This idea appears repeatedly in teachings that associate sacred knowledge with ethical refinement rather than intellectual mastery. Transmission of such traditions occurred almost entirely through oral instruction. Writing was considered dangerous because text could circulate beyond its intended audience. Oral transmission allowed teachers to assess readiness, character, and intention before revealing even partial information. This explains why references to the 72 names appear fragmented and indirect. The absence of full explanations is not evidence of loss, but of deliberate containment. At the same time, angelology became increasingly prominent in Jewish thought. Angels were not treated as independent deities, but as agents of divine action, each associated with specific functions and names. In some traditions, the 72 names were linked conceptually to angelic mediation, not because angels controlled them, but because angels were understood as embodiments of divine speech in action. Divine names, angelic roles, and cosmic order formed a single theological framework. This framework rejected the idea that divine names could be used mechanically. There was no concept of invocation divorced from responsibility. Texts that mention the misuse of sacred names consistently associate such behavior with spiritual collapse, madness, or exclusion from the community. These warnings were not rhetorical. They reflected a genuine belief that sacred language, when detached from moral grounding, destabilized the individual and threatened communal order. The destruction of the Second Temple intensified these concerns. With the central institution of worship gone, Judaism underwent a profound transformation. Authority shifted from priesthood to scholarship, from sacrifice to study, from centralized ritual to portable law. In this new reality, teachings associated with the temple, including traditions surrounding divine names, were reassessed. Some were reinterpreted symbolically. Others were set aside entirely. The 72 names belonged to a category of knowledge that no longer fit comfortably within post-temple religious life. Without the ritual context that had once governed their contemplation, they were seen as vulnerable to distortion. Silence became the safest option. Rather than risk misuse, the tradition was allowed to retreat into obscurity, preserved only through hints, encoded references, and guarded allusions. Yet this retreat did not mean rejection. The conceptual legacy of the 72 names continued to shape Jewish theology in subtler ways. The idea that God could be known through attributes rather than essence gained prominence. Mercy, justice, wisdom, patience, and power became the language through which the divine was discussed. The names were no longer explored directly, but their underlying logic survived in ethical teaching and prayer. This shift reflects a broader pattern in religious history. When a form of knowledge becomes too powerful to control, it is not always destroyed. Often, it is transformed, absorbed into safer frameworks, or surrounded by silence. The 72 names were not erased by force. They were concealed by consensus, shaped by a collective decision that some truths must remain implicit rather than explicit. What emerges from this period is a clear principle. Sacred knowledge was never meant to be neutral. It carried weight, consequence, and responsibility. The disappearance of open discussion about the 72 names was not the result of ignorance, but of restraint. The tradition survived not through repetition, but through reverence, guarded carefully by those who believed that silence itself could be an act of faith. Beyond rabbinic circles, another stream of evidence preserves traces of how sacred names were understood and experienced. In the desert communities near the Dead Sea, groups often identified with the Essenes produced manuscripts that reveal a worldview saturated with hidden knowledge, angelic presence, and structured divine order. These texts do not present speculative mysticism. They describe disciplined communities that believed their worship participated in a cosmic liturgy already taking place beyond the human realm. Within these writings, divine names appear indirectly, woven into hymns, blessings, and liturgical formulas. The emphasis is not on pronunciation, but on alignment. Members believed that correct order, purity, and obedience allowed human voices to harmonize with the heavenly assembly. Language functioned as participation, not control. Sacred names were not tools to command the divine, but signs that one stood within divine order. Several hymnic texts describe angels praising God through structured speech, repeating patterns that mirror the order of creation itself. Scholars have noted that these patterns reflect a shared assumption. The cosmos is sustained through divine utterance. In this framework, names are not labels, but active forces that maintain reality. The 72 names, while not explicitly listed, fit naturally within this logic as expressions of divine action rather than isolated words. The Dead Sea Scrolls also reveal an intense concern with secrecy. Certain teachings were reserved only for full members who had undergone years of preparation. Knowledge was stratified, not democratized. This mirrors earlier rabbinic caution and reinforces the idea that sacred language was considered dangerous when removed from ethical and communal boundaries. Silence again appears as protection rather than absence. Angelology within these communities further clarifies how divine names were understood. Angels are described as messengers formed through divine command, their identities inseparable from the tasks they perform. Names, roles, and authority are fused. This suggests that to know a divine name was not to possess secret information, but to understand function within the divine economy. Knowledge implied responsibility, not power. Early mystical traditions known collectively as the chariot traditions developed in parallel. These writings focus on ascent, vision, and proximity to divine presence. Yet, even here, the tone is cautious and restrained. Accounts describe overwhelming encounters, terror, and the risk of death or madness. Divine names appear surrounded by warnings, emphasizing preparation, humility, and obedience. The 72 names appear in this environment not as a goal, but as a boundary. They mark the limits of what may be approached safely. The texts emphasize that proximity to divine speech is destabilizing unless the individual is transformed inwardly. The danger is not punishment, but disintegration, language too powerful for an unprepared mind. This understanding challenges later assumptions that ancient traditions pursued power for its own sake. The evidence suggests the opposite. Sacred knowledge was treated as volatile, requiring containment. Communities that believed reality itself was sustained by divine speech approached language with caution, bordering on fear. To misalign oneself with that speech was to risk collapse, not gain advantage. As centuries passed, these communities disappeared, but their manuscripts survived. When rediscovered in the modern era, they revealed a religious world deeply concerned with order, restraint, and the ethics of knowledge. The silence surrounding the 72 names was not a gap in tradition, but part of the tradition itself. Through these texts, it becomes clear that divine names were never meant to circulate freely. They were embedded within a disciplined life, protected by communal boundaries and moral expectation. What later generations would call erasure was, in its own time, preservation through limitation. The names remained present, not as spoken formulas, but as silent structures shaping how the divine was imagined, approached, and feared. By late antiquity, Jewish mystical thought had entered a new phase. The destruction of the temple was now generations in the past, and religious life had reorganized around study, prayer, and memory. Yet beneath this stable surface, a current of visionary mysticism persisted. It did not disappear. It adapted. This was the environment in which early mystical traditions concerned with divine presence, ascent, and sacred language took on a more defined form. Texts associated with the chariot tradition describe encounters with the divine throne as overwhelming and dangerous. These writings emphasize not curiosity, but survival. entry into the divine realm required preparation that was physical, moral, and psychological. Fasting, purity, discipline of thought, and mastery of sacred tradition were prerequisites. Even then, success was never guaranteed. Failure was described not as punishment, but as fragmentation of the self. Within this framework, divine names functioned as thresholds. They marked points of transition between human perception and divine order. The 72 names appear indirectly, often embedded within longer sequences of sacred designations or alluded to through their structural logic. Their presence is felt more than stated. The avoidance of explicit listing reflects a belief that exposure itself carried risk. These texts make clear that sacred language was not symbolic in the modern sense. Words were believed to participate in the reality they described. Divine names were understood as expressions of divine action, rather than identifiers of divine essence. To encounter them was to encounter movement, judgment, mercy, and transformation. This understanding stripped away any notion of neutrality. Language either aligned the individual with divine order or exposed them to instability. Warnings dominate the literature. Teachers cautioned that even minor deviations in intention could lead to disastrous consequences. Pride, impatience, or desire for control rendered sacred knowledge destructive. The 72 names in this context were portrayed not as instruments of ascent, but as forces that would reject the unworthy. The danger lay not in divine wrath, but in the incompatibility between human ego and divine structure. This period also witnessed increasing anxiety about unauthorized transmission. As mystical ideas spread beyond tightly controlled circles, concerns arose that sacred traditions could be distorted or exploited. Stories circulate of individuals who attempted to access divine realms without preparation and suffered irreversible harm. These accounts functioned as boundary markers, reinforcing the necessity of restraint. At the same time, philosophical currents influenced Jewish thought, particularly engagement with Greek ideas about language and being. This interaction sharpened distinctions between divine essence and divine attributes. The names came to be understood more clearly as attributes, modes through which the divine engages the world, rather than as representations of the divine self. This shift allowed theologians to preserve the tradition conceptually, while restricting its practical application. The 72 names thus became increasingly abstract. Their power was acknowledged, but their use was confined to contemplation rather than practice. They survived as theological architecture rather than operational knowledge. This abstraction was not dilution. It was a defensive adaptation designed to preserve meaning without inviting misuse. By the early medieval period, the tradition existed in a paradoxical state. It was widely known that such names existed, yet almost nothing concrete was said about them. Silence was no longer merely caution, it had become convention. To speak too openly was to signal irresponsibility. Authority was demonstrated through restraint, not disclosure. This transformation reshaped the destiny of the 72 names. They ceased to function as active elements within religious life, and instead became markers of a deeper, more dangerous layer of tradition. Their absence from open teaching was itself a statement. Not all knowledge is meant to circulate freely, and not all truth serve the community when exposed. What endured from this era was not a manual or list, but an ethic of knowledge. Sacred language was understood to demand alignment of character, intention, and community. The 72 names remained present as a conceptual boundary, reminding scholars that the pursuit of divine understanding has limits and that reverence sometimes requires silence more than speech. When Jewish mysticism entered the medieval period, it did not emerge from obscurity unchanged. The intellectual world had expanded, philosophy had matured, and language itself had become an object of systematic study. In this new environment, earlier traditions concerning divine names were reorganized rather than abandoned. What had once been guarded fragments were now woven into comprehensive theological systems, most notably within emerging Kabbalistic thought. Medieval Kabbalists approached the 72 names through structure rather than revelation. They did not claim prophetic access or visionary ascent. Instead, they treated sacred language as a reflection of cosmic architecture. Creation was understood as unfolding through stages, emanations, and channels, each governed by specific attributes of the divine. Names were not independent entities, but expressions of these attributes operating within the world. Within this framework, the 72 names were associated with ordered divine flow. They were derived, as earlier traditions maintained, from the Exodus narrative, but now interpreted through theories of letters, combinations, and permutation. Hebrew letters were understood as the building blocks of existence. Rearranging them was not an act of invention, but an attempt to understand how reality itself was formed and sustained. Yet, even as these ideas became more systematized, restraint remained central. Authoritative Kabbalistic texts repeatedly warn against practical application. The names are discussed conceptually, sometimes diagrammed, but rarely presented as something to be spoken or enacted. Knowledge without ethical refinement is described as spiritually lethal. Mastery of sacred language required mastery of the self. This period also introduced a sharp distinction between contemplative study and operative use. Contemplation was framed as safe, transformative, and legitimate. Operative use, especially outside strict moral and ritual conditions, was condemned. This distinction allowed the tradition to survive within scholarly discourse while insulating it from popular misuse. The 72 names became objects of meditation, not invocation. At the same time, the spread of manuscripts created new challenges. Written material could travel beyond intended audiences. To counter this, authors employed ambiguity, symbolism, and omission. Crucial details were hinted at, but never explained fully. Silence was encoded into the text itself. Understanding required not only reading, but apprenticeship, context, and lived discipline. This approach shaped how later generations encountered the tradition. References to the 72 names became more visible, yet less accessible. The names were no longer erased, but transformed into intellectual landmarks, known to exist, yet unreachable without guidance. Their power lay in what they implied, not in what they revealed. Importantly, medieval thinkers rejected the idea that divine names functioned as tools of control. The divine could not be compelled, manipulated, or accessed through technique. Any suggestion to the contrary was treated as distortion. Language was meaningful only insofar as it aligned with divine will. Detached from that alignment, it became noise or danger. This theological posture placed the 72 names in a paradoxical position. They were central to understanding how divine action was conceptualized, yet peripheral to lived religious practice. Their role was explanatory, not functional. They explained how God could be both transcendent and active, hidden and present, singular and expressed through multiplicity. As Jewish communities navigated persecution, migration, and internal debate, this restrained approach proved resilient. It allowed mysticism to coexist with legal tradition and philosophical inquiry without destabilizing communal life. The names survived not as forbidden relics, but as silent scaffolding supporting broader theological reflection. What emerged from this era was a tradition that had learned to preserve itself by refusing accessibility. The 72 names were not denied or forgotten. They were absorbed into a framework where understanding replaced use and reverence replaced exposure. In doing so, they endured, not loudly, but securely, within the deeper architecture of Jewish thought. As Jewish mystical ideas circulated beyond their original communities, they entered environments shaped by different theological priorities. Christian scholars encountered references to divine names through translations, polemical writings, and indirect transmission. Stripped from their linguistic and ritual context, these traditions were often misunderstood. What had been a disciplined theology of language was reinterpreted through frameworks unfamiliar with Hebrew cosmology. In some Christian intellectual circles, divine names were recast as symbols of hidden wisdom rather than expressions of covenantal relationship. The emphasis shifted from ethical alignment to speculative curiosity. Elements of the 72-name tradition were absorbed into broader esoteric systems, often detached from their scriptural origins. The careful restraint that had defined Jewish transmission was replaced by selective appropriation. At the same time, ecclesiastical authorities viewed such material with suspicion. Any teaching that suggested hidden power within language risked association with forbidden practices. As theological boundaries hardened, traditions linked to sacred names were increasingly marginalized. Censorship, reinterpretation, and condemnation followed. What could not be integrated safely was either neutralized or rejected outright. This process altered how the tradition survived. In Christian contexts, references to divine names were often filtered through allegory or moral symbolism. The structural method derived from Exodus was rarely preserved accurately. Instead, fragments circulated without explanation, divorced from the linguistic precision that had given them meaning. The result was distortion rather than continuity. Within Jewish communities, this external misuse reinforced existing caution. The fear that sacred traditions could be appropriated or corrupted justified further silence. Teachers became even more selective, limiting discussion to trusted circles. The boundary between preservation and disappearance grew thinner, but restraint remained the chosen path. Meanwhile, Islamic theology developed its own rich discourse on divine names, emphasizing attributes of God expressed through language. Although parallels exist, Islamic scholars generally rejected the 72-name structure as foreign to their scriptural tradition. This divergence further isolated the concept historically, situating it firmly within a Jewish interpretive lineage that few outside the tradition fully understood. By late medieval times, the 72 names occupied an unusual position. They were widely rumored, occasionally referenced, and frequently misunderstood. They appeared in polemics, marginal notes, and speculative writings, yet rarely with accuracy. The tradition had not vanished, but it had become obscured by layers of reinterpretation and fear. This obscurity was not accidental. It reflected centuries of deliberate distancing from open exposure. What began as disciplined concealment gradually became historical marginalization. The names survived, but their context did not travel easily across cultures that no longer shared assumptions about language, covenant, and responsibility. The result was a fragmented legacy. Later generations encountered echoes without framework, references without explanation. The 72 names became known more for their mystery than for their meaning. What endured was the aura of something once powerful and now inaccessible. In this way, the tradition was neither fully transmitted nor entirely lost. It existed in the space between memory and silence. The erasure was not imposed by a single authority or moment. It was the cumulative effect of misunderstanding, appropriation, and protective withdrawal. What history records, therefore, is not the disappearance of sacred knowledge, but its transformation under pressure. The 72 names remained present, but increasingly as shadows, visible enough to provoke curiosity, yet distant enough to resist possession. The shift from an oral and controlled tradition to the written word had a profound impact on the 72 names. While their oral transmission once ensured that they remained within the confines of carefully preserved contexts, the written tradition introduced new risks. The ability to copy, print, and distribute texts meant that the tradition, once safeguarded by ritual control, could now be disseminated without oversight. This transformation, while expanding the reach of sacred knowledge, also contributed to the fragmentation and distortion of the tradition. In the Renaissance, scholars began to look back at ancient texts with renewed interest, uncovering fragments of Jewish mysticism that had been long overlooked. For many in Christian Europe, the allure of the esoteric was irresistible. 72 names, along with other arcane elements of Kabbalistic and Hebrew traditions, were seen as keys to unlocking hidden mysteries of the universe. Writers, poets, and philosophers became fascinated with the idea of divine names as powerful symbols, stripping them further from their original context. These intellectuals often approached the names with a mixture of awe and romanticism. To them, the names were not necessarily tied to any specific god or divine will, but rather represented an ancient source of wisdom that transcended religion. As a result, the esoteric traditions surrounding the 72 names began to be more universally applied in Western mysticism. Occult groups, alchemists, and later even some early New Age thinkers adopted these traditions, seeing them as a way to understand the hidden forces that governed reality. However, what was once a tightly guarded theological practice now became a tool for speculative philosophy. The esoteric interpretations were creative, but they lacked the moral and ritual structure that had once underpinned the name's meaning. Without the proper context, the names were reduced to abstract symbols of spiritual power available to anyone with the right knowledge. This shift from theology to occultism, from sacred practice to intellectual abstraction, signaled a profound change in the tradition's trajectory. Yet, while this transformation exposed the tradition to new interpretations, it also distanced it from its original purpose. The Kabbalistic understanding of the 72 names, with its roots deeply embedded in ethical practice and divine order, had been lost in favor of speculative and often disconnected readings. The divine names were no longer seen as linked to God's direct interaction with the world, but as mystical tools for personal enlightenment or power. Despite this, traces of the original tradition endured within more conservative and scholarly circles. Jewish scholars, though operating under different conditions, continued to view the 72 names with caution. Even as the Western world became enamored with the mystical potential of these names, those within the Jewish tradition maintained a more guarded approach, reiterating the importance of context, intention, and the need for spiritual purity when contemplating the divine. As modernity progressed, so did the separation between the mystical traditions that had once been central to Jewish thought and the more secularized intellectual environments of Europe and the Americas. By the 19th and 20th centuries, the names had become symbolic of the elusive nature of truth itself, often used in literature and art to convey an enigmatic, otherworldly presence. The names themselves were not just relics of a distant past, but metaphors for knowledge that eluded the grasp of those who sought it without preparation or humility. The impact of this transition is still felt today. Modern interpretations of the 72 names, often divorced from their religious and cultural origins, are pervasive in pop culture, occult practices, and even the self-help industry. While some continue to approach them with reverence, many see them as mere curiosities, objects of fascination rather than sacred tools. This ongoing trend of reinterpretation and distortion reflects a broader pattern in how sacred traditions are reshaped by modernity. The deeper meanings are obscured, and the power once inherent in the names becomes diluted. Despite this, there are those who continue to study the tradition with reverence, seeking to reclaim the purity of its original purpose. Within these circles, the 72 names are still seen as an essential part of the spiritual journey, a reminder that knowledge, when approached with humility and discipline, can transform not only the individual, but the world around them. However, as these teachings become more and more marginalized, the original intention behind the names continues to fade further into history, leaving behind only fragments of a once potent spiritual force. Modern scholarship approaches the 72 names without the fear or reverence that once governed their transmission, yet this distance has revealed something crucial. When historians, linguists, and archaeologists examine the sources, they do not find evidence of a sudden prohibition or violent suppression. Instead, they observe a slow narrowing of access. The tradition faded from visibility not because it was destroyed, but because the conditions required to sustain it gradually disappeared. Academic study confirms that the method used to derive the 72 names from the Exodus narrative was consistent with ancient interpretive practices. Parallel techniques appear in other forms of Jewish exegesis, where meaning is uncovered through structure rather than paraphrase. This places the tradition firmly within the intellectual world of antiquity, not on its fringe. It was neither superstition nor innovation, but a disciplined engagement with sacred text. What changed over time was the surrounding culture of restraint. As religious life adapted to new social realities, fewer communities maintained the intensive, ethical, ritual, and educational frameworks that once governed access to sacred knowledge. Without those frameworks, the tradition could not function as intended. Silence replaced instruction, not because the knowledge was false, but because it was no longer safely transmissible. Scholars studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, early rabbinic writings, and medieval manuscripts consistently note the same pattern. References to divine names are present, but explanations are withheld. Warnings outnumber descriptions. Authority is expressed through what is not said. This pattern suggests continuity of caution rather than loss of information. The idea that the 72 names were erased implies an external force acting against them. The evidence points elsewhere. The erasure was internal, shaped by responsibility rather than fear. Communities chose containment over exposure, depth over accessibility. In doing so, they ensured survival at the cost of visibility. Modern popular culture often interprets this silence as mystery or conspiracy. Academic analysis rejects that framing. There is no hidden cabal guarding forbidden knowledge. What exists instead is a tradition that required conditions no longer widely present: mastery of sacred language, disciplined moral life, and communal accountability. Without these, the tradition naturally receded. This perspective reframes the entire question. The disappearance of open discussion about the 72 names does not represent a failure of transmission, but a successful one. The tradition accomplished exactly what it was designed to do: prevent misuse. Its silence is evidence of intention, not accident. In this light, the 72 names stand as a case study in how ancient societies managed dangerous knowledge. Rather than codify and disseminate it, they limited it through ethics, hierarchy, and silence. When those structures weakened, the knowledge withdrew rather than adapt improperly. The modern world, oriented toward access and exposure, struggles to recognize this logic. Yet, when examined on its own terms, the tradition reveals a sophisticated understanding of power, language, and responsibility. The names were not meant to survive as objects of curiosity. They were meant to survive as boundaries. What remains today is not a missing list, but a historical trace of restraint. The 72 names endure in the spaces where speech was deliberately withheld, reminding scholars that absence can be as meaningful as presence, and that some forms of knowledge are preserved precisely by refusing to be spoken. What ultimately survives of the 72 names is not a formula, a pronunciation, or a recovered sequence of letters. What survives is a worldview. Ancient Israel did not understand divine power as something to be seized or activated. Power flowed from alignment, not technique. Language was sacred because it participated in reality, and reality itself was understood as sustained by divine intention rather than human control. The tradition of the 72 names reflects this conviction with remarkable clarity. The names were never presented as shortcuts to transcendence. They emerged from narrative, memory, and collective experience. They were drawn from a moment of crisis and deliverance, embedded within a story of vulnerability rather than dominance. Their origin in the crossing of the sea anchors them not in abstraction, but in history, fear, and trust. Over time, communities learned that preserving such knowledge required more than memory. It required restraint. As conditions changed, as ritual frameworks weakened and shared assumptions dissolved, silence became the only ethical response. The names were not hidden to create mystery, nor suppressed to maintain control. They were withdrawn because they no longer belonged to a world that could carry them safely. This withdrawal reveals a profound insight into how ancient religious cultures understood responsibility. Knowledge was not automatically good simply because it existed. Some knowledge demanded maturity, discipline, and context. When those conditions were absent, preservation meant refusal. The 72 names were not erased by forgetting, they were protected by limitation. In modern discourse, this challenges familiar narratives. We often assume that truth must be exposed to survive, that silence signals loss or deception. The history of the 72 names suggests the opposite. Silence can be an act of fidelity. Absence can be intentional. What appears missing may be precisely what was most carefully guarded. Today, fragments of the tradition remain visible in scholarship, language theory, and theology. They appear in discussions of divine attributes, in reflections on sacred speech, in the enduring belief that words shape reality. Yet, the core remains inaccessible, not because it was destroyed, but because access itself was the condition that failed. The 72 names were never meant to be possessed. They were meant to orient. They pointed toward a relationship between humanity and the divine that emphasized humility over mastery and reverence over display. In this sense, their disappearance from open practice is not a tragedy. It is the final expression of the tradition's logic. What was erased from history was not a list of names, but a cultural posture capable of holding them. The world that produced the 72 names understood that some truths do not survive exposure. They survive only when approached indirectly through discipline, ethics, and silence. And so the tradition ends where it began, not with speech, but with restraint, not with revelation shouted aloud, but with meaning embedded quietly within text, memory, and reverence. The 72 names remain present, not as words waiting to be spoken, but as a reminder that the deepest forms of knowledge are those we are taught not to use, but to respect.